This video is to show several different techniques that you can use with watercolor, specifically when you use watercolor on a already wet paper. So for our first technique that we're doing today, it's a wet on wet technique where you wet the paper first. And you let it soak in just a little bit. Try to make your water even, and you can tell if it's even by looking at how it shines. If it's really shiny, you might want to wait a little bit. Once it starts to dull a little, then you're probably ready. Now I have some paint, and you only need a tiny little bit, like a pea-sized amount of each color to start. So to use this correctly, you first want to dilute your paint to make what's called a wash. Oftentimes when we make a wash, it'll be in a separate dish, but for right now, we're just going to try to dilute the paint so that it's even. I'm going to rinse my brush so that any chunks of paint that I got from the little blob here aren't stuck to my brush, and I can just use this nice diluted paint. So first I'm just going to add that color to my paint on one side. And one objective is to try to get it so that you can't really see the brush strokes, and having the paper wet first helps to keep the brush strokes to a minimum. You just want it to look like it's evenly flowing into each color. So on the other side, I'm going to add some yellow. I'm going to dilute my paint. Rinse out my brush a little bit. And then add yellow on the other side, mixing it together just a little bit to make an orange color. And this is how you can get more than two colors by mixing the two. And you don't want to touch it too much because once the paper starts to get broken down, it really won't look very good. So it's best just to let it be and let it kind of mix as it dries. The next technique, we're going to start out by using a Sharpie and the inside of a masking tape roll, which has a little extra paper in there, so we'll try to smooth that out. And we're going to make a circle. And we're going to use a wet on wet technique that will keep the paint within that shape, and we're going to try to keep the paint as even as we possibly can. So I'm going to wet inside the shape, and I'm going to mix in some extra paint into that wash I had there. Now it's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind not to use paint from the tube directly, because it will never really come out as even as you want it to. You can use it that way, but for our purposes today, you're not going to. You just got to use your paint diluted. So you can add your color to this shape, and if you've kept your water within the lines, then your paint should not come outside of the shape. It'll stay within that wet area. Now to keep it even, I'm going to use a paper towel, and where I see some extra paint, I'm just going to lightly touch my paper towel into the shape. You want to keep turning your paper towel, because if it starts to get dirty, then when you keep blotting it, you're going to add some paint and get little spots on your paper. So it's good to have a pretty clean paper towel. When it looks pretty even, you should stop and never rub it. Always just tap gently. For our next technique, we want to use a pretty concentrated wash, which means that we're going to use all of this blue paint. I'm going to rinse out my brush. And I'm going to use some clean water. It's a little bit tinted, but I'm going to add some water to my paper and let it soak in just a little bit. And for this one, we're going to see a neat effect with salt. So now that my paper's wet, I'm going to add some more paint. It's best to have a pretty dark wash for this. You'll see the effect much better. And we can even it out a little bit just to get some practice on making it even. If you get a little light spot Just know that the paint, as it dries, will flow around a little bit and might fill it in. But if it looks like it's really, starting to dry up, then you can add a little water, maybe a little more paint, try to get it even. And then, important, before it dries, I'm going to grab a little salt. You just want a little bit, and you want to sprinkle it in between your fingers, just a few grains. If you put in too much, it won't really work. You have to have room around each grain of salt, so doing it very carefully is important. If you just dump it on, you won't really see the results. And the effect happens as it dries, so we're just going to leave it be after we pour some grains on and see what happens once it dries up. For our last technique is another one with a shape. So we're going to use our tape roll. And for this one, we're going to try to give a shaded effect. So I'm going to try to keep my water within my shape. And then I'm going to add paint only to one side. And then on the side that I want to look shaded, I'm going to blot. And there you have it. So you can start to see the salt effect beginning. It starts to look a little bit like stars. If you've left enough room around each grain of salt, each one will absorb some of the paint and pigment and water into it as it's drying, and you'll get a small little spotted effect, which is pretty neat. And that's it.